Welcome, everybody, and I am absolutely delighted to be having this conversation with the very talented and insightful Dr. Ramona Vijeyarasa. I'm Carol Schwartz, the chair of the Truella Foundation and the Women's Leadership Institute Australia. I want to start by taking a moment to reflect on the traditional lands on which we're placed and acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation where I am today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Before we kick off the discussion, let me briefly introduce Ramona and her book, The Woman President. Dr. Ramona Vijeyarasa is the chief investigator behind the Gender Legislative Index, a tool designed to promote the enactment of legislation that works more effectively to improve women's lives. Her work combines law, engineering and data science to reinvigorate decades-long debates about the law's role in addressing gender inequality. Ramona is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Law, the Juris Doctor Program Head at the University of Technology, Sydney, and a Women's Leadership Institute Australia Fellow. Ramona has just published with Oxford University Press a fascinating book called The Woman President. And in this conversation, I will unpack with Ramona some of the key findings. Let me just briefly outline the premise of Ramona's work. Women have never made up more than 15% of the world's prime ministers and presidents. And despite hiring ratios and gender equity policies becoming more commonplace in the workforce, only 30 women worldwide are leading a country. So, what is the impact of having a woman president on the legislation passed in a nation? Does it improve the lives of fellow women? And what is a woman's issue exactly? Applying the case studies of 4 women presidents in South and Southeast Asia, Ramona examines the influence that having a woman leader can have on enacting legislative change in a nation, finding that laws may be enacted at a faster pace when women lead. The book also debunks the narrow idea of women's issues and calls for a gender assessment on issues as diverse as democracy, development, peace and conflict, anti-corruption, industrial relations and taxation. Ramona, thank you so much for joining me today. And before we dive into the themes from the book, tell us a bit about your background and passion for women in leadership and why it matters to you.
Thank you, Carol, for joining me for this incredibly important conversation. If I look back in my career, I've been very privileged to have a very rich career as a women's rights lawyer, working all around the world. I have worked alongside and listened to the stories of countless women from all regions who continue to struggle for law reform to improve their lives. Now, I think while gender equality seems very far away, I have seen progress in so many areas over the last 15 years. But the one area where I've seen very little change is women's occupation of executive office. As you mentioned, Carol, by my count, there are only 30 women presidents and prime ministers today. That's out of the world's 200 or so countries, some of which have both the role of president and prime minister. That's how we arrive at the reality that women only occupy less than 15% of executive seats. That means women are not at the global decision-making table, not the G7, not the G20. Women are not heading their countries to inspire future women to run for office at this level. What it's also meant is that academics like myself have a very small data set from which to draw if we want to examine what difference the presence of women in these offices actually means for fellow women and society generally. So I returned to academia after 11 years working for non-governmental organisations and intergovernmental organisations to undertake this study at the University of Technology in Sydney. And I set out to explore this difference 4 female presidents have made on women's lives in Indonesia, Sri Lanka and the Philippines. The Woman President is this book that can provide a lens into that difference women leaders make and fill this gap in our knowledge, because it's a story that's just not being told.
And why did you choose women in Asia, Southeast Asia. Why was that your example?
Well, I think there's this really fascinating phenomenon where, although there's very few women who've made it to executive office, there are relatively high numbers of women in South and Southeast Asia who've risen to power. A lot of that has happened thanks to familial relationships, occupying seats that were previously occupied by a father or a husband or mother. If you think of the examples of Corazon Aquino, who took after her husband, or Megawati, whose father was a long-time leader of Indonesia. Having said that, I think it's really important that we move away from our lens of understanding leadership being just North America or Europe, and we start to think, what lessons can we learn from these experiences of women's leadership in our own region, in South and Southeast Asia?
Yeah, fascinating. I was really interested into why, but what you say makes absolute sense. And of course, you've developed the award-winning Gender Legislative Index. Can you share a bit about what it does and why it's seen as being such a valuable tool?
Sure, Carol. And I think it's important to start with the premise behind the Gender Legislative Index. I'm an avid lover of the law. I made a barrister's briefcase when I was 9 years old out of cardboard for a library project. I've always wanted to be a lawyer. But I also very much believe in the power of law to redefine society. I think law can shift social norms. It can embed new ways of living that make societies more equal. And I also believe that the law can do better in improving the lives of marginalised, excluded, and underrepresented women. So I created the Gender Legislative Index as a way of measuring how well the law is doing in exploiting its full potential to make societies more equal. And it's a tool that can be used by women's rights advocates, by legislators, by NGOs, or by large-scale development organisations. With a team of evaluators, the Gender Legislative Index evaluates laws against 7 criteria derived from international standards that almost all countries in the world have already signed up to. Evaluators apply benchmarks from women's reproductive health through to workplace gender equality that enable them to decide whether a provision of a law is gender regressive at one end or gender responsive at another. And there's a really exciting machine learning element that uses artificial intelligence to provide an overarching score for the law on a scale against international standards. So to me, the GLI has so much promise. It has the potential to tell countries where they stand relative to others, but importantly, to bring global attention to the countries that are doing well and that other countries can learn from if they have that political will. Sometimes that may be the Nordic countries who are world leaders on paid parental leave, for example. But in other instances, it may be countries right on Australia's doorstep that are legislating better than us. And the Gender Legislative Index offers those insights when there's a political readiness to bring about this legislative reform.
Yeah, and that's, of course, assuming that that's information that the legislature wants to be known, right? Because it can be quite embarrassing about the impact of legislation on women. And I'm sure that there are certain circumstances where legislatures don't want that specifically pointed out.
Absolutely. But it's a story that needs to be told, because if we don't ask ourselves how are different people and different women differentially experiencing the law, then we'll never work towards law reform and exploit that potential of the law to help societies achieve gender equality. It's a really key part of that pathway that we need to walk if we're actually going to make some progress on gender equality at a faster pace than we currently are.
Absolutely. And we've already touched on, the women that you've chosen. And you explore really 4 very different female presidents from, as you say, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. And interestingly, as you point out, none of these women had an overtly feminist agenda. And this was important to the assumptions about female leaders that you did actually want us to test, or that you wanted to test. And tell us a little bit about what you discovered and what your thinking was about this.
Well, I've really found that despite not having an origin in the women's movements or coming to politics with a women's rights agenda, under all of the leaders I've studied, we saw the passage of women-friendly outcomes. But I suppose whatever approach you take, it's important to tell an accurate story in a study of this kind. I didn't brush over cases of corruption in the Philippines or Sri Lanka, or instances where the female president vetoed reproductive health law reforms in the Philippines, or where the primary opponent to a gender equality quota was in fact the female president, as in the case of Indonesia. So despite telling that truthful story, and despite identifying women leaders who don't naturally seem advocates to women, under the Philippines' Corazon Aquino and Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, Indonesia's President Megawati, and Sri Lanka's President Kumaratunga, these countries saw remarkable laws enacted that improved women's daily lives. Sometimes that was an executive order that actually brought in these laws, which meant it was directly thanks to the president that these legislative reforms took place. All three countries, for example, enacted laws that focused on ending gender-based violence from 2004 to 2005. In the Philippines, all the way back in 1992, when President Corazon Aquino was in power, she signed into law paid maternity leave. That was 1992. In Australia, we only introduced paid maternity leave in 2010. The Philippines also introduced 10 days of paid leave for victims of domestic violence in 2004. Again, Australia only is enacting that now. And today, the Philippines still benefits from the introduction of a requirement that all government agencies allocate a minimum of 5% of their total budget for programs on gender and development. So they have a gender responsive budgeting enacted into law. And even though Megawati opposed it, Indonesia did enact a gender equality quota for political parties to nominate women in 2003 under President Megawati. So, all of these are successes that need to be celebrated. And that story about that positive law reform and women's friendly legal and policy outcomes, it's important to tell it.
And you also in your book talk about the appointment of more women under these women presidents and women leaders. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, Carol. And I think this is a really important part of the study, because if you want to look at appointment powers, they're extremely powerful, it's extremely significant who somebody appoints to be in their cabinet. Now, we might want a 50% female representation in cabinet. That's equity and that's ideal. But we also need to set this analysis in the context of the time. And I think a fair assessment is to look at how many women cabinet members did the male predecessors appoint before these female came into power. And in 3 out of the 4 presidents, these women leaders appointed more female cabinet members than the men who went before them. In Indonesia, she actually matched the men who went before them. Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo appointed a remarkable 12 women cabinet members, up from 2, and President Kumaratunga 5, also up from 2. On top of that, they also appointed women to fairly non-traditional cabinet posts. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, there were first Muslim woman member of parliament, was appointed the Minister for Construction, Housing and Development. And why this was so significant is then she played a pivotal role when the tsunami hit Sri Lanka, because she led that construction and housing response and oversaw a situation where they made sure women widows received funding and where women were represented at all levels of the Tsunami Recovery Committee. So it's not just an acknowledgement of how important it is to appoint women to these cabinet roles, but the difference they can make in representing and bringing to bear the experiences of women in times such as the tsunami emergency that Sri Lanka went through.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we know, and the data shows that women will ensure that it's not only themselves that are being looked after, but also families and broader communities.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's, such a fascinating book, and congratulations again. But what are you hoping to see in Australia, at both a federal and state level?
Well, if I could share 2 lessons, Carol, from the book, I think the first one is a bit around a mindset change. And then the second would be a practical intervention, which goes back to your earlier point about how ready legislators are to hear that the law's not working. So as I mentioned earlier, I think there's really great legislative good practice right on Australia's doorstep. Now, many listening would know that Australia ranked 43rd in this year's World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index, down from 15th in 2006. Now, today, among all the medium or big size sort of Western countries, Australia only ranks ahead of Italy and Greece. So we know we can do better. And I know these indices are far from perfect tools, but the reality is in Australia, we have this unacceptable gender equality gap. I would love Australia to be more open to learning from global good practice. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. In some cases, Australia can be a leader, but there's plenty of gender responsive legislation that we could be investigating more rigorously and adapting to our national context. So this could enable Australia to enact laws to achieve more equal shared caring in the home, to create free, accessible early childhood education, to advance workplace gender equality and greater transparency around inequality in the workplace, to have allocation of superannuation during paid parental leave, to advance housing tenure through the law, which is obviously a huge issue for Australian women. So I think, my lesson from looking at all this good gender responsive legislation right here in our region, in South and Southeast Asia, is can Australia be more open to looking for that global good practice? I think, sorry, Carol, go ahead.
No, so I was going to say, so what's your reaction when you read in the media about reports such as Liz Broderick's around the harassment and bullying and sexist behaviour in our parliaments, both federal and state?
Look, I think the reality is that there's two sides to the story. On the one hand, it's positive that the story is being told. A decade ago, that story wasn't being uncovered. And obviously women were suffering through that harassment without having an opportunity to have their experiences heard. So there's a positive that has to be acknowledged, and we have to hope that change is coming. At the same time, I think it's quite clear that if the workplace is not a safe one, how can the work be done at the end of the day? So there's a huge burden on the shoulders of women who make it into politics to do more for women, to do more for their communities, and to represent women well so that the future women who stand up have a positive pathway to walk into politics. Now, if they cannot get on with the job of the day because of the harassment, the discrimination, the misogyny, and the lack of accountability, they're being stifled from doing their job. And in any other workplace, there would be reporting mechanisms and transparency and accountability. And that's obviously what we need to see in Australian Parliament. So, I'm pleased that the story is being told, but I would love to see change.
Yeah, wouldn't we all? And Ramona, last question. Where are you hoping to take this research into the future?
Thanks, Carol. It's a great question, and one that a lot of people are asking me now as I've just published this book. I think writing The Woman President really showed me that we can't just talk about the absence of women in executive office. We need to talk about what happens when women are present, and we need to do that with very sound data and academic rigor. I'm really keen to look at the impact of women leaders outside of the traditional stories. So what's going on in Africa and what's going on in Latin America? And I think Africa is a really great example because many know Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was Africa's first female head of state and led Liberia for 2006 to 2018. And then you've got Joyce Banda of Malawi and Amina Gurub Fakim of Mauritius. But right now, there are a lot of women rising to the roles of Prime Minister or President in Africa, in Namibia, in Togo, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Ethiopia, among others. So who's telling their stories and who is tracking their positive gendered legislative footprint? So that's one area that I think would be really interesting in terms of global research.
Can I ask you just one quick thing about that?
Sure.
Is there any element of the glass cliff in the context of these women assuming the leadership roles in these African nations?
I think that's a tricky one to tell, partly because that is such new language that hasn't necessarily been applied to this context. I suppose Ellen Johnson Sirleaf would say otherwise because she led for so long. So she took the country possibly through crises, but also for much longer periods of time. I think a lot of the other women have come into power in much more recent periods. What's interesting, however, is that there's quite a lot of women in Africa who've led as acting women leaders. And so I could only assume that's been in times of crises and very short leadership positions, in which case it's so hard for them to do anything and to achieve positive change and be the role model. So I would imagine it's possible, but again, it's a story that needs to be interrogated further to be told.
Yeah. Ramona, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I'm sure we could go on for hours and hours, but thank you so much and good luck with what your next steps are.
Wonderful. Thank you for chatting with me, Carol.